Thank you for joining us for this digital ethnography session with Dr. Joshua Bluteau, discussing his paper, The Performance of Many Selves in Everyday Digital Life, Immersive Cohabitation and Self-Portraiture as a Viable Ethnographic Method, hosted by Professor David Zaitman. A little housekeeping, we are fortunate to have a varied audience with a wide range of views, and we request the opinions of others are respected in this space. For your awareness, this event is being recorded and will be posted on our website following the event. Pose any question using the Q&A tab at any time. These will be answered at the end of the talk, and please keep questions as concise as possible. These will be visible to all attendees, and we will endeavour to follow up any unanswered queries. Please allow me to introduce David and Joshua.
Hello and welcome everyone. Before I introduce the speaker, I want to make an announcement about the last session this term, in other words, in 4 weeks' time, when we're having one of our regular digital methods surgeries. So if any of the students attending have particular methodological issues that they want to discuss with the panel of OxDEG, well, not only conveners, but everyone present, please get in touch. And what we're really looking for are some volunteers to talk for about 5 minutes about a particular methodological dilemma. We have had, I think we've only had one offer so far, so there are still some slots. Okay, that's about the future. Now let's talk about the present. I'm delighted that after a lot of kind of reshufflings, juggling, we can finally hear a presentation from Joshua Bluteau. He was a lecturer at the University of Manchester, now in Coventry in nursing and health. His doctoral research was on bespoke tailoring in London and how one studies such a phenomenal kind of haptic thing using digital methods is well, I find that utterly intriguing, which is sort of why I invited him. And with that, I will pass over to Joshua, who has no slides note. He's just going to talk. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's so lovely to be here. As has been said, this is a rather delayed presentation from me. I was initially invited to talk here at the end of 2019, following a paper I published in ethnography about immersive cohabitation, about this type of digital research that I've been doing. This was first delayed by industrial action and then obviously by COVID, but it's so nice to be here. And it sort of feels, kind of paradoxically almost, that the delay has made this, this paper even more pertinent than it might have been back in the mists of time. So I'm really excited to be here, and I hope that this paper has matured on the shelf, so to speak. I'm currently in the process of just doing the final finishing touches to a monograph about this research as well, which hopefully will be published later this year. So it feels very much in my mind at the moment. So I hope you enjoy. And as I've said, I'm not going to do any slides. I'm just going to chat. I'm going to talk through some of these ideas. And I really look forward to having questions at the end. So yeah, let's get started. The introduction I've had is exactly right. I've finished my doctoral research, and then I taught at Manchester for a bit, and now I'm at Coventry. And the route through anthropology into now my place in a health team seems rather disparate and bizarre, but actually it sort of picks up on some of the lovely strands from my research that seem to really pique my interest about kind of the digital world and about kind of well-being and how we sort of exist in these strange digital bubbles now, and what that says for the NHS and for various people. So it works quite well for me at the moment. So this paper, which I've entitled The Performance of Many Selves in Everyday Digital Life, Immersive Cohabitation and Self-Portraiture as a Viable Ethnographic Method. Takes these two kind of strands of immersive cohabitation, which I've already sort of hinted at, and self-portraiture as two sort of strands of the same thread, really. These two kind of key tenets of how I've conducted digital research. And we'll kind of get into the meat of those in a little while. But what I thought I would do is sort of lay out what my fieldwork looked like to start with, to sort of take you with me on a brief stroll through London. And so you can kind of see how these ideas developed and how I went from my initial fieldwork into something that actually changed and evolved throughout it. So when I began my doctoral fieldwork, I was, as David said, I was fascinated by clothes, by fashion, by avant-garde design, by aesthetics, and by menswear, fundamentally. I'd been really, really engaged by Miller and Woodward's work on denim and about blue jeans. And I thought, okay, this is fabulous, but what about the people who really don't want to wear blue jeans? What about the people who are having, you know, a £5,000 suit handmade for them? All of these sort of things. So I went to London and I started my research very much offline, and I never really anticipated moving online. I'd hoped that I would be able to perhaps do a tailoring apprenticeship or work in workshops or something like this, something very kind of old school and kind of physical. But as it turned out, the kind of tailoring apprenticeships and coat making apprenticeships, as they're termed, many, many years, I mean, 3, 4, 5 years. And that really was beyond the scope of the research I was kind of aiming to do at that point. So instead, I started introducing myself to tailors. I went into their shops. In some cases, I bought some of their products. And I started to make relationships with them in much the same way that anthropologists tend to do in their field sites. Some of this was on London's kind of establishment row of tailors on Savile Row, and in some of those shops I visited tailors, went into their workshops and saw them making their clothes by hand. But a lot of my research was in other bits of London, with tailors who were using the same kind of methods, handmade clothing in London, cut from paper patterns for individual clients, but have a slightly more design-focused aesthetic. And these were tailors like Joshua Kane in Shoreditch, who's a relatively new tailor, but one who is very design-focused. He's done shows at the London Palladium and does kind of enormously extravagant fashion shows, and is doing lots of kind of digital work now. He's currently working on a video game to sort of complement his design. So he's a very kind of digital-forward tailor. There's also tailors like Mark Powell, who is based in Soho, and another Soho tailor called Sir Tom Baker, who I also worked with. In the case of Tom Baker, I saw his fashion shows, and same for Joshua Kane. And for Mark Powell, he let me come and sit in his shop and view some of his consultations and things like this. Now, these tailors within this world are very high profile. I mean, Mark Powell is sort of known as the Soho Spiv. He loves kind of gangster-inspired, neo-Edwardian and modernist tailoring, and is supposedly, I believe this is true, sort of infamous for having made suits for the Cray twins when they were in prison. Equally, Sir Tom Baker is incredibly punk-inspired, so you'll have beautiful, handmade, floating canvas suits that are then distressed with shotguns and studded. There's this kind of friction then between the traditional tailoring of places like Savile Row and this kind of avant-garde, which is using the same sort of materials and the same processes, but aestheticizing them in a different way. Joshua Kane sort of traverses the boundaries here in that he produces Savile Row quality, well, or almost Savile Row quality suits by hand for individual clients, but he also holds a fashion line as well of ready to wear and off the peg. He was one of the first tailors who I became very sort of closely involved with, and he had an incredible sophistication of digital interaction, even at this point. And when I was sat in his shop chatting to him, I would see that he'd just be on his phone all the time, taking photographs, replying to clients, doing little videos, and posting constantly to the web. And as I was sat there, I thought, gosh, so there's all of this I can see, the workshops, the clients, the tailor, But there's this other world, there's this additional world happening where these images are being posted and people are responding to them and seeing them all the time. So it struck me quite profoundly at that moment that I needed to investigate this as well, and that if I neglected to traverse into this digital world, somehow my research would be blinkered, it would be one-sided. So that was the moment, that was a sort of a profound moment for me. As an interesting aside, some of the other tailors who I was working with at that point really didn't have any digital presence at all. It was very, very minimal. But since that point, most of them now have an Instagram, most of them tweet, and most of them have quite flash websites as well, which may not have been the case at the time. So there's been quite a, this was sort of about 2016 to 2018, that period. So there's been quite a rapid change in the way in which these tailors seem to interact with this digital world across that period. So that's just something to bear in mind. But with Joshua Kane, he was already there. He was already producing a lot of digital content. So whilst I continued this work in the field, going to shows, buying things, going into shops and talking to various tailors, I also started to look at what kind of digital stuff they were producing. And Joshua Kane was the first person in which I really began to interact online. I bought a hat from him in his sale. It was a blue wide-brimmed hat, and it's called the Gostic, and it's sort of like a fedora, but it was his sort of signature thing from one of his early collections. And I tweeted very early about it, saying, "Oh, at Joshua Kane Bespoke, just ordered your hat, very excited," expecting nothing back. And within a couple of minutes, I got a tweet back from him. And I was really shocked that this person who in some respects, I had a sort of idolized relationship with, this kind of designer that I had sort of been to his shop, but I didn't really expect him to want to talk to me, had privately messaged me back. And this set a tone for our relationship online, but also gave me an insight into the way in which these very digitally agile shops and shopkeepers, if that's terminology we can use these digital platforms to cultivate customers and cultivate clients. So this fascinated me, and I started to move further and further into this world. And as I looked around and saw what was happening in the various different digital platforms on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, I saw that images were being produced by these various tailoring houses, and particularly by some of the younger tailoring houses. But Instagram was the place where really it was happening. Yes, the worst stuff was reproduced on Twitter and reproduced on Facebook, but Instagram was the platform with the majority of content and the majority of interaction. So I began to sit on Instagram for hours a day and to see what was happening. This was very much a period of participant observation. I was there, I was looking, and I was seeing, and you could see as each time the page reloaded, a new set of images appeared, the kind of content that was being created. But for me, this really wasn't enough. And so from that point onwards, I decided that I needed to embed myself more closely, more clearly within this digital space. And in order to do that, I sort of looked around at what other digital methodology there was at this point, and I was sort of disenfranchised in some way with what others had written about it, because nothing seemed to quite fit what I was doing. There were, wonderful people who'd written about projects that were conducted entirely digitally, people like Tom Belstoff's kind of work on Second Life. And equally, I looked at other work that had been conducted sort of viewing over the shoulder, so to speak, of others using digital technology. But for both of these, the contextualization of the projects was either totally online or totally offline. And for me, it felt as though something needed to sit in the middle of this. And so this is where my digital journey began. And this is where my idea of immersive cohabitation had its inception. So this notion of immersive cohabitation, this methodology that I developed over this time, didn't happen instantaneously and was certainly not fully formed to begin with. The idea of it as a coherent methodology is really a product of reflection upon this period of research as I moved into this digital space and began to play, to experiment, to find out what worked. So how did I do this? Well, in order to kind of talk you through this and to really have a kind of meaningful discussion about this, I'm going to chop the rest of this paper into kind of 4 key segments. the first one I want to talk about is how I kind of intellectually situate the digital fields. Once I've done that, I'm going to talk about immersive cohabitation properly and really try and unpick what it means and what it is for you. And then after that, I'm going to briefly talk about both self-portraiture and about performance and how those kind of strands sit kind of intrinsically into this as a methodological approach. Yeah, so let's get started then. For me, the field is a kind of difficult thing to wrangle with in this context. Initially going to London, that was very clearly my field site. It was where I went and where I decided that was going to be it. It was very easy and geographically focused and bounded. And I mean, it could even be sort of whittled down to a couple of streets. It was very clear. But once I began to enter this digital world, this muddied and became difficult to really wrangle with what it meant. Now, initially, I had conceptualized the online and offline space in exactly that way, as two disparate entities, two places. And so I was kind of fumbling with all these ideas about how I rationalize this as an intellectual approach and as an ethnographic approach. Is it multi-sited fieldwork, perhaps? But no, it didn't seem to be. So the more I thought about it, the more I engaged with the notion of the digital, I became detached from the idea that the digital and the offline were disparate, were separate, because when I was in these shops and when I saw these kind of tailors and their clients use digital social media, it wasn't a separate aspect of their life. It was embedded into their everyday life. Particularly in the early days when I was looking at Joshua Kane's digital production, he was producing dozens of images a day and being posted to Instagram. Later on, when more features became available on Instagram, this was supplemented with videos and with sort of montages through Instagram Live and through the Stories feature as well. So you could log on multiple times a day and see new content from him. It wasn't a separate entity. It was part of his everyday life. And the more I thought about this, the more I sort of engaged with the fact that in London, it's sort of nonsensical to talk about a digital field site anymore. And the term post-digital is what came to me. This idea that we're no longer living in a world of digital and non-digital, but it's so crashed together, so interwoven and so enmeshed that the digital and the non-digital have bled into each other. This post-digital world in which I now set this field work, this field site, is a kind of blended space of offline and online. And for me, these terms online and offline began not to be useful anymore because they sort of exemplified the difference between the two. But as they've become so melded together, I decided that a different type of terminology was needed. So what I use terrestrial and digital, terrestrial being the offline and digital being the online. Now, I think the usefulness of this is because I think we still need the terminology to differentiate, because of course now I'm talking to you digitally. There's a sort of digital version of myself out there speaking to you, but obviously I also exist in a slightly different form here in this room. And the way in which we experience those two worlds are ever so slightly different. The way you see me may be different to how I could be seen in this room. For example, you can see me from about here up and see what I'm wearing and see the room around me, but you can't see any more of me. So I could be lounging in a pair of lurid pajamas or something, but you would get a differentiation there in the view of what you can see and then the interpretation of that and so forth. And this is the kind of crux of it. This is the nub. So for me, the field is not a digital field. It's a post-digital blended field where the online digital world of Instagram and the offline terrestrial world of tailor shops and ateliers and workshops are a single thing. And to think of them any differently in my field doesn't really work. And that's sort of the key starting point for this idea of immersive cohabitation. So this is what I'm going to go on and talk about now. As I began to sit in this digital platform and look and see what was happening, I found that there were tailors there, I found that there were clients there, and I found that images of a kind of certain type were being produced. And as I sort of looked around, I started to get a sense of it. But what I noticed was that everyone I could see was producing images of themselves. Almost everyone who seemed to be within this kind of group were taking selfies or taking detailed shots of their clothing. So these were the kind of the two types of image, and this is something I would frame as a kind of discourse within the digital space. So there was a real kind of thematic idea that the self-portrait was used as a way of displaying oneself digitally. Now, I think a lot of this came from the tailors, who were obviously displaying what they were wearing at the time, and they were using their own bodies as a form of branding. But a lot of their followers seemed to be following suit. So I decided that in order to follow the progress of this research, this would be a good thing to engage in as well. And part of this, I will say as a brief aside, was an issue of access. So I didn't really have too much problem identifying some tailors who were willing to talk to me. There were other tailors who did not want to talk to me, and that's absolutely fine. But actually accessing the clients of the tailors proved a little more difficult. The tailor's shop is a strange space. It has a very intimate nature. I mean, the very fact that the tailor lays the sort of the tape measure on the body and has that kind of intimate relationship with the client about, you know, their size and their shape and all of those kind of issues makes the tailor's shop one that has to be a very safe space. And I think because of that, tailors were often wary about letting me view client consultations or be in the same spaces as their clients, particularly if I wasn't also a customer. When I became a customer of certain brands, then there was then a little more access. But even then, the consultation space was often set aside and private. So getting in touch with customers was difficult. But in the digital space, I found a plethora of these customers taking pictures of themselves in these garments and tagging the tailors. So it was quite easy to follow these strands. So this is how I began to engage in this ethnographic digital, post-digital world. And so this idea of immersive cohabitation developed over time as I continued to work digitally, and as I then started to take photographs of myself and post them to Instagram. My offline terrestrial fieldwork lasted for about 12 months, but the digital bit of my fieldwork, which initially ran concurrently, stretched for 2 years, and it really only stopped because I put a stop to it at that point to have a succinct sort of amount of data, really. It would have just run and run, and I've kept the account I used open, and it's there for you to view now if you wish. I have a digital self out there in the ether, and my digital self is called Anthro-Dandy, which is of course a portmanteau of anthropologist and dandy, a sort of self-identifying clothes-wearing anthropologist, both identified as researcher and as friend, hopefully, to one's interlocutors. So I would encourage you, if you're sat there listening to me, to pull out your smartphones and have a look. Instagram me and see what you think. You can have a little look as we chat. This is one of the really lovely things about doing digital research on a social media platform, that I can literally take you with me into my field, which is something that very few anthropologists are able to do in a situation such as this. So yes, Anthro-Dandy, feel free. And I can see people are already engaging. That's very nice, thank you. So I decided to create this digital self, and I created this character of Anthro-Dandy. And I began to take these portraits of myself, which I posted to social media, to Instagram, and I also mirrored them on Twitter, following the idea that my tailoring friends did. I began to think about how I should use this platform, and I began to consider some work of some of the people I was reading at the time, and I had read work by Ladislav Holly and by Wakant, and also by Brent Luvas, about trying to do as one's interlocutors do, not simply observing one's participant, but being an observing participant, not merely participant observation, but moving towards being an observing participant in this digital world. And this is what I did. So I tried to do what my informants did, which tended to be taking photographs of oneself in outfits and posting them to social media, as well as taking kind of detailed shots of what you were wearing. This idea of the outfit of the day, displaying what you were wearing that day, was incredibly important to this network. this took a long time. Not only because initially I was terrified of this, because I thought, oh my God, showing a picture of myself, it felt very, I felt incredibly vulnerable initially. What would people say? I mean, but after a while, I sort of dipped a toe in this digital ether, and I found that it was okay, that actually this network was very friendly. It was very supportive. Unlike many of the horror stories from the media and from other anthropologists I know who've worked online, it was a very supportive and very friendly place. And it seemed that anybody who disliked what this group of people were doing were just sort of dismissed from the network. They were blocked or they were removed. So it was very close and it was very tight-knit. But I only really found this out through the process of producing these images. And these images afford access to the network, but also because of the algorithmic way that Instagram seems to work, by interacting with these people and by these people interacting with me, I was able to make links and see that this sort of random group of people weren't a random group, but were actually a network that initially appeared sort of amorphous and not really bounded, but in reality was quite tightly bounded. And people seemed to know each other, even in a sort of digital friend sense. And so this was fascinating. I found that beyond the streets of London, I had this other place, this other field, or rather this other strand of this blended field in which to work. And so I really began to engage in this, and I really spent the time to try and learn the kind of language use, how people use images as a form of discourse, and how people try and use emojis as a sort of form of language. I mean, I think for me, this always feels like a replacement for Goffman's overlays, the emoji, in my network anyway. Yeah, and it was incredible. This network of men exist in this online space who post pictures of themselves all the time, showing what they're wearing. And it's wonderful. It's incredibly kind of joyful in many ways. And it's clear that people gain a real joy from it as well, which is also quite pleasing. At the time, this was really just a way of gaining access and learning through doing. But as I reflected on it, I realized that this was a sort of succinct methodological approach in its own right. It was a form of immersion within this group. But once I was there, my digital self that I created lived there. It cohabited alongside these informants. And I was minded of, when I was an undergraduate, the story was a sort of apocryphal tale almost. It's almost like a legend in anthropology of Malinowski moving from observing from the veranda to leaving and pitching his tent in the village, that sort of idea. And I felt that with this, I had almost left the digital shadows and pitched my tent within this digital network. That was kind of what I was going for, and it really felt like that's what I did. So I was very pleased with that. And after about 12 months of daily interaction, the network started to become clear. And this is really important, this idea that within the digital space, time has a disjointed feel because people aren't seeing you on a daily basis in the same way that they would in a terrestrial field. They see you in a more disparate way, which is in part influenced by the algorithm, but is also in part influenced by their day-to-day lives and when they're viewing it and a whole host of other things. So it takes longer to form these relationships. I would always counsel that for this sort of digital ethnographic research, perhaps more time is needed than maybe in a terrestrial field. So it's something to bear in mind. It seemed that a lot of time was needed, and only really 12 months in was I able to think, actually, I'm now starting to get worthwhile interactions, worthwhile data. So this idea of immersive cohabitation really forms the central tenet of this, and it now forms the central tenet of the way I continue to do ethnographic research. When I wrote the paper in 2019 about this, I really kind of tried to sketch out the bare bones of this idea, this sort of this methodological approach really about creating a self and performing in a particular way online and doing as others do, that working as an observing participant in the digital. But the idea of self-portraiture specifically is something that's become, it's sort of rung true really for me in more recent years. And I think now particularly when we're in this strange period of COVID and people's kind of webcams afford strange intimate access into their homes, and there's a sort of these self-portraits, if you like, the image you're seeing of me could be construed as a self-portrait because I've dressed myself in a particular way to appear in this manner. Instagram is a more focused version of this, because obviously that's the way in which people are interacting on a daily basis. They're very carefully crafting their image, they're posing, they're showing off the particular stitching on their jacket. But nevertheless, the way in which we now appear in meetings, in seminars, in conferences is vital and is very crucial. And I think there's about every 3 months, it seems, another story is on the news about people being sold bookshelves to go behind the complete works of Dickens and other things that they should be using to craft that digital self. That view into the intimacy of the home is a self-portrait in a certain sense. So it's become something I've become increasingly interested in as the time has passed. And so this paper, I'm trying to tease out what the point of self-portraiture is as a methodological tool. Because initially I was rather bashful about this. I was sort of, in some of the early stuff I started to think about, it felt like self-portraiture is a rather vain way of engaging in research. You know, it's something that I think is very exposing and is a difficult thing to think about dispassionately and objectively, because of course oneself is very much part of it. Yet despite this, the self-portraiture was something that was incredibly important to my fieldwork, not only because it afforded me access to this hard-to-reach space, this network of sartorialists who do the same practice, and who, without engaging in the practice as they did, I wouldn't have been able to form the connections with them that I did. But beyond this access, this key, if you like, into this digital realm, it also allowed me to understand the digital space in a kind of cartographical sense. It's a tool for map making within the digital, as well as purely access. It's both key and map making device all in one, because not only does it allow you access to this group of men, this network of sartorialists, but somehow through the algorithmic nature of Instagram, by creating these self-portraits that are then liked and commented on and linked with other people, you start to see connections. And once these connections have sort of been drawn within cyberspace, you can start to see this sort of mind map of strands, of kind of loci of interaction. And that's really how I began to see that a network existed, a bounded network. And yes, there were members of this network that belonged to other networks. And the example I always use here is a chap called Westwood Cowboy, who is, I believe his account is now private, so you might not be able to see his pictures. But he's a great fan of the clothes of Vivienne Westwood. And him and his husband they're from America, and they tend to dress in kind of matching or very outlandish Vivienne Westwood designs. They also have a pug who's now sadly died, called Mama Biscuit, who they adore and they dress up and they take to parties and things, so that they seem to have overlaps with other networks who are interested in dogs and interested in pugs and dog shows. And he's also interested in the sort of the artist Tom of Finland, who does kind of gay leather erotica stuff. And so there's also that network as well. So when you look at someone like him as an example, he sits in at least 3 sort of overlapping networks. So there's this enormous sort of Venn diagram of networks of various people overlaid and overlapped through their interests and their likes and their selves. And this is where we come to this idea of these many selves in everyday digital life. And this is really where performance starts to come in as a kind of form of self-portraiture. So that the title of this paper is obviously a sort of nod to Goffman's presentation of self in everyday life. And I really wanted to pick up on that, because for me, the notion of sort of Goffman's notion of performance, which I always think of as a range of hats that you can wear. You have the sort of the hat of the father and the hat of the lecturer and the hat of the, I don't know, mountain biker, whatever. These hats are different sorts of performance. But within the digital space, once a self has been crafted in the digital, that self begins to have hats of his own right. And these digital hats exist within cyberspace beyond the point where the offline terrestrial self is detached from the digital. So for someone like Westwood Cowboy, his digital self may have these three hats, but his offline self may have a totally different set of hats, if that makes sense. So there's these kind of series of different notions of self, and possibly even different selves that sit within the digital. So this kind of notion of performance is something that became incredibly important in relation to self-portraiture for me. The self-portraiture that I was conducting began really as a sort of well, at best an homage and at worst a shameless copy of what I was seeing around me. So whether it was tailors or other members of this sort of network that I was beginning to get acquainted with, who were very prolific and producing lots of content and had loads of thousands of followers, I was sort of looking at what they were doing and trying to replicate it, trying to learn what they were doing and replicate it. This process was certainly what occupied me for most of the first 12 months of the digital aspect of the research. But as I moved forward, I found that actually the most prolific accounts and the ones that seemed to have the most engagement weren't ones that were simply doing as doing as everyone else did, but they were doing what everyone else did, but with their own personality, their own sort of flavor, their own performance. And so this is how the character of Anthro-Dandy, this sort of digital self of mine, began to evolve and began to change. And if you look right back to the start of my digital journey online, the photographs actually changed quite a lot. Part of this is through the technology that was available to me, and my camera phone became better as my research evolved, but partly because I dropped it and I had to get a new one, but that's a separate story. But as the images sort of changed and I learned what kind of image was necessary, but also how I had to try and perform a bit of myself within the image, I started to understand a little more about the value of these self-portraits, not purely as a tool for access, but as a way of self-making and of knowledge production in its own right. And this knowledge production is something that seems very important to this form of digital working, because I didn't simply want to find out what other people were doing, but I wanted to experience in a sort of autobiographical sense how this felt and what this meant. And the experience of producing images in this way was quite profound. And through the 2 years of digital fieldwork, I posted 850 images to Instagram. And what I found was that after a while, once this self had been established within the digital space, and once this self had begun to interact almost on its own, it began to function as an autonomous actor in its own right, and it gained its own agency. And let me explain this a bit more. So my digital self, this Anthro-Dandy, began to exert an agential hold over my offline terrestrial self. Now, part of this is a sort of two-way street of digital interaction and of almost the addictive quality of this social media. So when you post a picture and you get an enormous amount of people liking it or commenting on it, it makes you feel good. You get this sort of surge of positivity. And much like seeking the thrill again, you want to experience it again. So there's a sense that you need to replicate that image, but make it even better. Now, this is a tricky thing when the garments being displayed, which are an inherent part of this process within this network, are very expensive. So for me, I spent an inordinate amount of time on eBay trying to source high-end tailoring for prices that were within my budget. That in itself was quite interesting, as I encountered a number of my digital sort of interlocutors, digital friends in that space as well. But that's really an aside. It ended up as though it got to the point, I should say, that this digital self functioned almost like a Tamagotchi, that sort of that toy of of childhood that you have to constantly feed, you have to maintain. There's a sense almost of it having a doll-like quality that has to be dressed as well. And this is exhausting. The time pressure involved in upkeep of this digital entity is huge. Not just the buying of clothes, which has an additional financial burden, but also the dressing of the body, the deciding what clothes to wear, the taking of the photographs, the deciding what time of day to post them, and so on and so forth. But in order to keep a currency within this digital space, that is a necessary part of this methodology. And one of the things that I began to glimpse through the sort of digital shadows was the effect that this had on other users. One of the interesting factors about this is, whilst I think now the kind of notions of mental health and well-being online are quite freely talked about and are much more open, at the time there were flickers in the digital shadows of this. People who were posting very, very regularly would suddenly disappear for weeks at a time. And when they came back, there would be a post apologizing. They'd say, you know, I'm really sorry, I had to take some time away. This wasn't ubiquitous, but was certainly frequent enough to warrant the notice. And in addition to this, there were comments and stories of people staying up through the night, answering their comments and taking their images. And sometimes people would let you see past the camera and see into their lives that weren't quite as perfectly choreographed as the images they presented. There was a knowingness that the images they presented were not representative, or not a perfect representation of the offline version of their selves. But for me, this really exemplifies the disjunct between the online and the offline, the digital and the terrestrial selves. And that these selves which sit in the digital ether, crafted of digital discourse, crafted of images, really start to take an agential hold. And they start to exert themselves in their own right. They start to almost demand new outfits, new clothes. They demand to be fed and nourished. And this was certainly the experience that I had. And another kind of interesting aspect of this was how that digital self began to be seen by some as almost a more real representation of the self, of the researcher, than the offline terrestrial self. So I would have friends going, oh my God, you weren't wearing that earlier. And it would be a post I'd posted that morning, but it might have been a picture I'd taken days before. There was an analogous relationship here. People assumed that it was identical, but it wasn't. And they felt let down. They felt betrayed somehow that it didn't match. And this is the kind of true friction of this field, the understanding that these digital selves are created as a way of creating alternative selves. But there's a disjunct. And these digital selves that have been created and promoted and that people enjoy creating start to drift and start to take on a character of their own within the digital space. And so this is one of the great conclusions. And as I'm sort of starting to draw towards a conclusion here, I want to sort of bring one other idea into this, which is obviously huge within the anthropological corpus and wider, but the idea of time as well, and how we think about the digital time frame. And for me, the time experienced on the digital platform of Instagram is kaleidoscopic. So you get this strange series of shifting, overlaid presence, presence as in present, not untie with a bow presence, a series of shifting, overlaid presence. So when you open your phone and flick down and look at Instagram, you see a version of the present, but that version may not be necessarily the present that someone has posted in. So for me, my anthro dandy has been quiet for 12 months now. He has decided that within the world of coronavirus and the pandemic, he's not going out. He's staying at home, he's isolating. But if you were to look at his pictures now, you would see them in a version of your present. And he still holds that agential quality. He still has the ability to exert power over myself, when people interact with him. But also he retains a currency within the digital space. Initially in my fieldwork, when I took time away from the field, I lost followers very quickly. But with the amount of images he now has, he doesn't seem to lose any followers. He seems to retain a sort of currency within the digital space, which is quite curious and certainly worthy of further investigation. So I want to tie all this together really now, as I know I'm starting to get towards the end of my time. And what I really want to think about in all of this stuff is how we think about digital working, both in times of coronavirus and times of pandemic, but also moving past this period. And one of the things I think is quite pertinent from this research, it's certainly the thing that always strikes me, is that within a kind of Western-centric field site, and I use that because that's where my research has been based, but certainly this may be applicable to a far wider set of circumstances. Within somewhere like London, it seems to me that it's almost impossible now to conduct terrestrial ethnographic research without doing it in a way that appreciates the embedded and enmeshed digital world that sits not even alongside it, but within it. And for me, it seems that this notion of multiple selves that sit within this digital ether is something that is starting to spill out and become greater and more profound as time goes past and as people engage with digital platforms and digital technologies in new ways. And within this period, as I have said, that my Anthropology has gone dark, so to speak, has gone quiet for a year. Within that time, I have created with my partner a different Instagram. We've just bought a house and it's a complete wreck, and we're doing it up at the moment. But we've created a renovation Instagram called The First Renovation. And this is a different form of my digital self. It's a different space. It's a different character, but it's also a shared character. So there's an aspect of me in there. There's perhaps an aspect of Anthropology in there, and there's an aspect of my partner in there too. So how do we ratify that? How do we unpick what that means and what impact that has on the terrestrial self? But also the forward-looking notion of selfhood within a space where almost infinite versions of self can be created, maintained, and interact within a amorphous, overlaid and overlapping digital ether. So that's sort of where I'm going to draw it to a conclusion, I think, just to sort of to briefly pull through again. The four themes I've tried to engage with here are how we think about these digital worlds and whether they're disconnected or whether they're enmeshed in the terrestrial. I've talked a little bit about immersive cohabitation and the key aspects of this methodology that I've developed and that I think are worthy of discussion and worthy of taking forward into other fields. The idea of creating the digital self, performing the same tasks as one's interlocutors, and engaging in that space every day for hours at a time over a protracted period. And then the other two aspects of this talk, we're talking about self-portraiture, talking about why self-portraiture is an important knowledge-making device for anthropologists and for other disciplines too, both, I think, in the digital world and beyond. And how all of this sits within a tapestry of performance, and how performativity as an inherent aspect of ethnography can be incredibly valuable in a ever-changing and increasingly digitized world. Thank you so much for listening. I'm really excited to see what questions you have. Thank you.
Cool. Brilliant. Thank you very much. All sorts of wonderful, provocative things there. While people, we've got some questions coming in, but just to get things going, I wanted to pick up a couple of things. One is there's an interesting parallel, it seems to me, between immersive cohabitation and Christine Hines' 3 E's. I've written them down: everyday, embedded, embodied. I mean, she was writing that about the time you were doing your research, but I mean, I like her stuff a lot. I think one of the things I often say at these seminars is to make parallels between old style anthropology, what you'd call terrestrial lives. And it's a way of kind of, I suppose, saying this isn't as new as people like to think it is. And so, I mean, there are all sorts of things that you were saying about Goffman. I mean, I love your phrasing, the tapestry of performance. But I can, I mean, the idea that people have multiple selves in a way, I mean, it does go right back to Goffman. I mean, I could imagine, I'm not going to talk about myself. I'm going to talk about someone I know in the long distant days when I used to go to pubs. And so there's someone I know who has an identity as a pub quizzer, an identity as a drama school teacher, a drama teacher at school, sorry, I said that the wrong way round, a cook, and I could imagine a completely separate identity as a football supporter. And you know, and then maybe they go to a church or a mosque. And so in a way, everyone has always juggled the performance of multiple selves. What's great about the digital is it becomes, in a way, easier to get a handle on it. Perhaps I don't know, do you want to comment on that? And then I'll go to things from the Q&A.
Yes, no, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And I think one of the fantastic things about digital research is that it isn't that detached from, you know, traditional anthropological approaches. It's another form, and it's keeping anthropology current that we engage with it in the same way. And I think a lot of the same questions that have always been asked are still there to be answered. And I think the fascinating thing is that people are using these digital spaces in ways that we can observe, you know, across time and across culture and across history. I think one of the fascinating things about the Instagram is how sort of specific some of the networks are. So for lots of people, they'll use social media in a way that they just chat to their friends, their offline friends, and that's quite different from what I do. But for these people, they're kind of bound together by this shared love. It's a club, I suppose, if you like. So for them, that particular bit of their personality that is performed in a very kind of one-dimensional way within this space, and I think that's really fascinating.
Excellent. Okay, Bill, you had a question.
Yes, so thank you. I'm Bill Kelly. I'm a co-founder of the OxDEG seminar and a co-convener, and also an anthropologist of Japan by training. Really found this fascinating. Just to comment briefly on something David said, I mean, I think this is one of the aspects of Facebook, isn't it? Because Facebook is a place where multiple identities and multiple circles in which you have different identities can, if you're not careful with your settings, converge in awkward ways. So I think that's a really good example of that. Your talk also reminded me a lot of John McManus's work. He was a PhD student here, and he worked on Turkish football fandom. And he pretty much ended up doing something like a form of blended cohabitation, just because it became clear that Facebook was so much a part of fandom in the stadiums itself. People were on their phones simultaneously while they were watching the game and tweeting, sending messages to people who couldn't be at the game, but were also fans of the same team. So his work is really interesting and resonated when I was listening to you. And then finally was a question. I was interested in knowing how your entry into the immersive space of Instagram might have affected, I mean, you mentioned, and it seemed like a great opportunity. You mentioned that it had a profound effect on access to clients and being able to interact with clients in ways that you couldn't so easily in the terrestrial space. But I also wondered if it had any effect or impact on your relationship with tailors themselves. I mean, were they aware that you were there? Were you tagging their products? Did it make any difference in terms of your field work specifically with tailors, or did that remain pretty much a terrestrial project, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, that does make sense. It very much flowed back on itself, actually, which again is perhaps a useful tool, really. So with Joshua Kane, who forms kind of one of the major characters, I suppose, within this field work, I bought a number of things from him, and then he would send me emails saying, "Oh, I loved that picture of you on Instagram and that thing." And I went to one of his fashion shows where his partner at the time was sort of manning the door in a pink suit, and she said, "Hello, Joshua." We'd never met, but she knew me by name. So purely, I presume, because she'd seen pictures of me on Instagram and we had sent messages to each other. So there were certainly moments where the boundaries had blurred totally, and yeah, the world of Instagram had flowed back into the terrestrial. And I think which was lovely, I suppose, but it helped to cement those relationships as well. I know that there's this idea of polymedia that is talked about by various people, that, the overlaid series of different kind of platforms used to increase intimacy, I suppose. And that was certainly something that I observed as well, that you'd get emails followed by a Twitter message, followed by a meeting in person. And there was a sense that the conversation was continuing through those platforms. So yeah, it initially was very separate, but became increasingly interwoven as time went by.
Okay, people have been asking incredibly long questions. I'm going to try and shorten them. And apologies if I am being cruel in shortening it. So at the top of the list, and I'm not quite sure why, I've got question from Juliana Friend, who is asking about the literature animation in anthropology. So people like Gershon, Manning and Nozawa, who are building on Goffman and Alfie-Gell, and do you find that useful as a complementary analytic to performance?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not very up on the literature animation, I must say, and it's not something I've really considered. But that's really interesting. That's something I'd like to go away and have a think about. I would also like to pick up just earlier in that comment, or that question rather. There's a comment about how Anthro Dandy emerges as a he, and that's quite important. He is a he, and that is partly because of the network of informants that he lives within, who are very clear to identify themselves as men, and more specifically through terms like dandy and gentleman. So they have a very particular type of masculinity, which they sort of self-fulfill through the discourse that they produce. So yes, he is a he.
Okay. Oh, the sequence on these questions is jumping up and down as people are voting them, I suppose. Right, who's next at the top? Then I've got there's a question from Neha Gupta about methodology. Oh, blimey. What methodology do you think would be best to compare leadership in different democracies? That's a very big question.
That is a big question. Well, rather than prescribing a particular methodological approach, I suppose it's more what's out there. I mean, I found that with this research, my methodology emerged from how I found a way of accessing the kind of data that I needed or hoped to find. So, and I think had I gone about this piece of fieldwork with a very prescriptive form of methodology to start with, I don't think I would have got out of it what I would hope to. So I would caution against being overly prescriptive about a methodological approach, and go with the flow a little bit. Look at what's out there and look at how you can access certain things, and then maybe reconsider what works best for you.
Yeah, I would absolutely echo that. I think that, again, this is part of the ethnographic. The general stance of us as anthropologists is that we don't start by saying these are the methods I'm going to use. We start, as it were, playing with a whole raft of things and see what works. And in a sense, your talk exemplifies that. That at the beginning you hadn't appreciated the importance of things like Instagram, and it emerged as, and then it having emerged, you followed it. Okay, so next we have Benedict Turple saying, do you think your research changed what you wear when you're not posting? I was going to say posing. Oh, interesting. So, I mean, how have you been changed by your experience? Is my rephrasing.
Yes, that's a very good question, and a very interesting kind of thought, and it's one that I have been thinking about myself recently, and I'm not entirely sure how to answer, because right, okay, so when I began this research, in terms of my sort of appearance, I suppose I was a little bit younger, and I sort of was into skinny jeans, and I quite liked a Heeley boot, and kind of I did like tailoring, but I wasn't that into kind of suiting. I was more sort of I suppose sort of, that was my look. I liked a Cuban heel and tight jeans and a kind of little jacket. I have certainly gained an enormous appreciation for detailing and the aesthetics of the tailored body, and what that means, and how shape and size can be augmented and altered throughout that. It's certainly changed what I wear and how I think about clothing, and it's certainly changed how I see other people being dressed. I'm obsessive about sort of, I've written about in the monograph that I write at the moment, I'm writing about, seeing people's buttonholes as they walk past and being able to tell whether they've been hand stitched or not, and what that means about where their garment was made. It really has flowed into my consciousness. But in terms of how I actually look, I think having a job and being a little bit older may have more to do with it than the research, possibly. But I'm certainly a little more sober and a little less fitted, perhaps, than I used to be. And I don't know if that's to do with the research I did, or or the result of the lockdown spread. I'm not sure, but
Thank you. Okay, well, for the record, I should reveal that my jumper was knitted for me by my mother. So,
it's very nice.
Thank you. It's a Guernsey. So Alex Blanford, hi Alex, has a question about the invisible boundaries of the platforms, and how individual different networks have particular vibes. So what's the question there? I'm not quite sure. Oh yeah, he just wants you to talk about it.
Yeah, I'll just chat about it. So there's sort of two things I would say here. Firstly, you're absolutely right, Alex, that there are vibes within these networks, and people follow them for particular reasons. And we've seen this more recently in light of things like the American election, where certain platforms have deplatformed particular people, and their followers have moved to different platforms, which are seen as perhaps more freer would be a word for it, I suppose, in some people's view, that allow certain discourse to be promoted, whereas others have certain descriptions about that. In terms of Instagram, it certainly has a sort of free and easy vibe to it, where people are happy to produce these images. It's very visual, obviously, but one of the interesting, let me say one thing first, that in terms of boundaries, the groups or the networks within Instagram certainly have a boundary within which there's a kind of self-regulating policing of the kind of images that are deemed appropriate, and that's policed through affirmation and reciprocity. In terms of the kind of greater sense of what the Instagram is, I think they do promote certain types of personality, I suppose, for these social medias, but there's also undercurrents of displeasure about it, about the kind of images that are removed, and what that means. And I know a number of my followers are quite exercised about that, particularly in terms of the sort of images that they don't think are equitable that have been removed. So there's often a question about prohibition of certain types of body, and they tend to be the gay body, particularly in particular forms of undress, is seen as more offensive somehow than the female body in undress. At least that's the rhetoric that's discussed by members of my network. So there are things, there are undercurrents as well about, you know, what this space is for and what it polices against and what that says about appropriateness, which again is a very old anthropological question.
Yeah, indeed. And that leads very nicely on to the next question, which is from Sarah Ahmed. And she's working on Facebook, but she's asking about differences between things like Facebook versus Instagram, more textual, more visual, and what the different platforms, which are particularly photographs or video based, and how the impacts of those platforms on different sorts of performativity.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Sarah, that different platforms need to be appreciated and approached, bearing in mind the kind of discourse that is there. I would say I chose Instagram, but I suppose Instagram chose me, really. I chose to work with it because that's where my tailors were working. And Instagram is kind of the primary choice of fashion and tailoring houses, purely, I suppose, because it's very visual and because it can be used to showcase the details and magazine quality pictures in high definition. I would say, in terms of other platforms, a different type of analysis needs to be completed. Certainly, if it's text-based, it's very different. But in terms of performativity, I suppose all forms of social media are performative in a sense. I think it's perhaps easier to analyse performativity when it's video or visual, but it's certainly not impossible to think about it in text form, because I suppose in the same way that I talk about these digital selves, there's a digital self within Facebook perhaps, but they're producing text rather than a manifestation of themselves. So yeah, I would say perhaps a different analytical approach, but there's certainly flavours that spread across all of these platforms, I think.
Okay, I mean, I would have thought that text, in things on Twitter, really, you could do an analysis on, you know, and I think Twitter remains primarily primarily textual. Okay, Charlotte Livingston has a question on the differences between what terrestrial selves and digital selves. She's talking about self-siloing, which kind of can erase what she says is less tangible and less conscious aspects of the terrestrial self. I'm not sure if that contrast really holds, but I mean, what do you think?
No, I'd be cautious about that, because I certainly think that there can be the creation of a digital self, and that can certainly gain control and gain power from the terrestrial self, but I'm not sure that the terrestrial self can disappear entirely. I mean, I suppose there's a question there about death and about the existence of a digital self beyond the existence of the terrestrial. An interesting sort of thing that happened to me is that when I had a number of my images reposted without permission by tailors and other people, and there's an interesting question there about ownership and power and, you know, the physical manifestation of the self being repurposed without permission. That certainly felt like a loss of self to a certain degree, and I think that must be the case for celebrities with enormous amounts of followers whose images are taken and repurposed and manipulated on a grand scale. But I think this loss of self might be more of a digital thing than a terrestrial thing. But I think it depends how obsessive we are about it. If we spend our entire lives locked in a room, dressing up and taking pictures and posting them online, which I suppose is the sort of absurdist reduction of this, then yeah, maybe the terrestrial self can be lost.
But yeah, I remember going to a funeral, it's now a long time ago, actually, so long before COVID, and at the funeral of this person, I learnt about aspects of their self, which I had no idea about, because I knew them, you know, as it were, wearing one of their terrestrial selves, wearing one of their hats, but they were also a musician, they were also an actor, and I had no idea. So, I mean, again, and, you know, I mean, as your talk exemplified, that's, you can do that online as well. So again, I would say that there may be less difference than you might realize. Who's next? Zabina Orosh. Yeah. How was there any interaction between the Anthro Dandy and your, as it were, private digital network?
Yes, there was. I mean, and there are a number of reasons for this. I mean, firstly, Anthro Dandy is open access, which is an intentional sort of, you know, so otherwise people wouldn't be able to see me, which was crucial. And friends began to find me, which is fine. And I didn't particularly mind. I mean, I was initially a little concerned about this, about, you know, where do those boundaries sit and what can you do about it? But it sort of became the case that it didn't seem to matter. Initially, I certainly got some shtick for it, that it's a very kind of posturing, peacocking kind of activity to go with. But I think the more it went on, and the better it got, almost, people just accepted it and would ask about it and say, "Oh, what was that thing you were wearing?" You know, it actually gave me a different insight into people's reactions to it who weren't within the world of kind of tailoring and clothing. So it actually gave it more body, it gave it more dimension, really. And it was interesting how people who weren't necessarily within that world actually were really interested in aspects of it, really interested in what I was wearing, or, you know, some tiny detail of, you know, cuff embroidery or something. So I think it grounded the research to a degree. It kept me from being swept into this hole of purely sartorially inclined interest. Yeah, I think it was actually quite useful. So it was something I would certainly encourage. It's sort of a sounding board, I think, for alternative views, which is quite useful.
Right. Okay, then we have another question from Sarah about how do people actually conform to performativity of selves in the terrestrial world and reproduce it or challenge it online? Wow.
And there's something here about kind of Sartre's notion of kind of appropriateness and function, I suppose. It's you know, the way that we perform and produce our notions of self in life are regulated by the society in which we live, and certain behaviours are seen as inappropriate, I suppose, are either legislated against, or you know, you're prevented from doing by the police, or by certain social norms and by cultural norms as well. I mean, offline in the terrestrial world, those are very complex and very nuanced, and can be everything from sort of disapproval to imprisonment and everything in between, I would say. So the performativity has to fit within a sort of a prescribed set of social rules. Online, the same is true, but because of the online space, tools are available to allow these kind of prescriptions to take place. So people can be unfollowed, or people can not have any form of reciprocity, or people can be blocked, or it depends on the platform. There's various different various tools. So within my network of sartorialists, content that was produced, sort of discourse that didn't seem to fit within what they were interested in looking at, would either be ignored, or the person would be blocked, or, you know, there wouldn't be any interaction. So for people who wanted interaction, the best, or the ideal preferred type of image was promoted, and so you had a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, really, where a particular kind of discourse was continually reproduced by everyone because that's what everybody wanted to see, and that's what gained sort of approval. I'm not sure if that answers the question, really, but
yeah, it certainly goes that way. Then someone anonymously has asked about money, about the impact, the importance of economic considerations, and how those interact with the presentation of self in these digital spaces.
So is this question asking about my sort of economic situation, or?
Oh, good question. No, it ends if no one were to gain economically in any way from these presentations. Do you think individuals would choose to present themselves differently? So it's general.
Because I mean, what I was initially thinking about was access to tailors, and I think that that's a really interesting question. That certainly many tailors were not interested in talking to me unless I bought things from them, at which point suddenly the gates opened. They were very happy to talk. But certainly in these kind of shops, there's a quite profound economic impact of that. In terms of the production of self online and the kind of economic aspects of that, I'm not sure. I think for some people, they certainly use it as a mode of self-promotion, and that might be linked to their business or to their whatever they do in life. It has an aspect of professional persona about it, certainly. I'm not sure it does for all, actually. Certainly not all the ones I was involved in. For some, it's really a hobby and it's something they're fascinated by and spend lots of money on and they're interested in. But I'm not sure it particularly impacts on them economically, apart from perhaps negatively through buying lots of shoes.
Yeah. Okay. Then we have Wan Kiao Chen about asking about authenticity of digital selves, and about the difference of how your online friends, what your online friends thought about you, as opposed, and how that impacts on your understanding of your online friends. Wow,
that's a biggie.
It is.
Authenticity is it's something I really struggled with in this project, and something I thought about a lot and really kind of wrangled with. It's it's one of those, it's one of those anthropological behemoths, isn't it? But authenticity, firstly, authenticity within the digital network I worked with was something that wasn't spoken about explicitly, but was certainly there as an undertone, as a native term, and to talk about people who, firstly, to talk about people being true to themselves. Now, initially, I thought this meant being true to their offline terrestrial self, but it became clear that this was not the case, and that the authenticity of being true to oneself was about being true to the digital version of oneself. So having a kind of coherent set of images was really important. And if they weren't really coherent, that wasn't seen as authentic. So it didn't matter whether the online self was different to the offline. It mattered that the content online was coherent. That was seen as a form of authenticity. So that maybe that's a good starting point. But I think also this kind of front stage and backstage bit is difficult, but I think it's perhaps just another way of thinking about these different hats, these different selves. I think you're still a self when you're backstage. You're just wearing a different, you've taken off your onstage hat.
That's the sort of meta message from Goffman, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
There is. I mean, if you say that there is no, if it's an anti-essentialist reading of the self, there is no self, so no ultimately authentic self, then worrying about authenticity, we basically just have to stop doing it. But then you might, in a network, you might have a locally produced definition of what counts as being. And I imagine that, especially in your tailoring networks, that would work. Yeah,
definitely. And I think that is how it seems to be. I mean, it may be the case that there is a sort of essentialist notion of self that fits, is a bag to keep your hats in. I don't know, not stretch the metaphor too far, but something greater, that's sort of an umbrella. But I don't know. Yes, it's for me, authenticity is a localized thing in a network rather than something greater.
Okay, well, we're sort of running out of time, and we're running very conveniently out of questions, which is excellent. We have been sharing links to your papers, and everybody seems very happy. So can I just ask everybody to switch their microphones on, and we can give Joshua a round of applause. I don't know if that's working at all. Sometimes that works.
That's very kind.
Yeah, well, thanks, Joshua. Now, of course, now is the time when we all go down the road and have a pint of beer in the pub. So we are going to have to do virtual versions of this. But for the record, we owe you a pint of beer.
Thank you. I look forward to it.
Yes. And I can't remember what the seminar is in 2 weeks' time. Can you, Bill?
Neither can I. Sorry, David.
Oh, okay. Sorry, putting you on the spot. But we reconvene in 2 weeks' time, when I'm sure it will be another excellent seminar. And so thanks so much to Joshua. And remember, in 4 weeks' time, the methods workshop. Method surgery, I think we're calling it. So we'll see you then. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Joshua. Thank you very much.
Thank you.